The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 204, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Sarah Bennett sat quietly in the back row, her sharp brown eyes taking in every detail of the room she'd visited countless times before, though never quite like this. Today, she wasn't here as a designer measuring the space for new judicial furnishings. She was here as just another face in the crowd, waiting for her case to be called. At 42, Sarah carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built something meaningful from scratch. Her charcoal gray business suit was perfectly tailored. She'd made it herself, of course, and her natural hair was styled in neat, professional braids. A leather portfolio rested in her lap, containing documentation about the faulty parking meter that had led to this court appearance. The courthouse staff bustled around her, paying no attention to the woman who had designed the very robes that draped the shoulders of judges across the state. To them, she was just another defendant on the morning docket. A young white clerk walked past, not even glancing in her direction as she sorted through a stack of files. Sarah noticed how the same clerk had warmly greeted every other person who'd walked through the door that morning. Sarah checked her phone one last time before turning it off. 3 messages from her workshop manager about a rush order of judicial robes for the new batch of judges waited for her response. 20 years of hard work had turned Bennett Judicial Designs from a small alterations shop into the most respected judicial robe designer in the state, but none of that mattered here, not today. The wooden bench creaked as more people filed into the courtroom. Sarah watched as a nervous young white woman sat down beside her, clutching a tissue. The woman's hands shook as she dabbed at her eyes. Without hesitation, Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a pack of tissues, offering them with a gentle smile. "First time in court?" Sarah asked softly. The woman nodded, taking the tissues gratefully. "Traffic ticket," she whispered. "I can't afford it." Sarah patted her hand reassuringly. "Just breathe. Tell your story honestly, and remember, you have every right to be heard." It was advice Sarah had given countless times to young designers in her workshop, many of whom came from backgrounds where their voices were often ignored. She built her business on the belief that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance or background. Through the side door, Judge Richard Harrison swept into the courtroom, his black robe billowing slightly with each step. Sarah's trained eye immediately recognized the garment. It was one of hers, crafted 6 months ago with the judge's measurements. She remembered adding the subtle touches that made her robe special: the slightly higher collar for better draping, the hidden comfort panels, the reinforced shoulders that helped the robe maintain its shape through long days on the bench. The irony wasn't lost on her. The man who would soon pass judgment on her case was literally wrapped in her craftsmanship, though he had no idea. Sarah straightened her spine and took a deep breath, remembering her father's words from long ago. "Your work speaks louder than their prejudice, baby girl." The bailiff's voice rang out across the courtroom. "All rise. The court of the 4th District is now in session, the Honorable Judge Richard Harrison presiding." Sarah stood with the rest of the room, her movement graceful and measured. As she rose, the young woman beside her stumbled slightly, and Sarah steadied her with a gentle hand. Several rows ahead, she noticed how the white defendants nodded respectfully toward the judge, receiving small nods in return. When the room was seated again, Sarah remained poised, her expression neutral but alert. The morning docket was full, 23 cases before lunch, according to the board outside. Sarah was number 18. She settled in for the wait, watching as Judge Harrison began working through the cases. With each interaction, she observed his demeanor, his tone, the way he addressed different defendants. As a designer, she'd learned long ago that the devil was in the details. Today, those details were painting a picture she knew all too well. The young woman beside her would be called first. Sarah gave her one last reassuring smile, whispering, "Remember, you have a right to be heard." The woman squared her shoulders, drawing strength from Sarah's words. Sarah Bennett sat back, her portfolio ready in her lap, and waited for her turn before the man wearing her creation. "Case number 2374, Sarah Bennett," the court clerk announced, her voice echoing through the now half-empty courtroom. The morning had dragged on, and the afternoon sun cast different shadows across the wooden floors than when Sarah had first arrived. Sarah rose smoothly from her seat, gathering her portfolio and walking forward with measured steps. She could feel Judge Harrison's eyes on her, though he barely glanced up from the papers on his bench. The young woman she'd comforted earlier, who'd successfully had her ticket reduced, gave her an encouraging smile from the back of the room. "Miss Bennett, you're here contesting a parking violation at 1247 Main Street, dated September 15th, Judge Harrison stated flatly. His tone suggested this was just another routine case, another face to process before he could break for lunch. The robe he wore, Sarah's creation, shifted slightly as he leaned forward. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice clear and professional. She opened her portfolio, ready to present her evidence about the malfunctioning meter. But before she could continue, Judge Harrison cut her off. "Miss Bennett, do you realize that contesting a simple parking ticket takes up valuable court time?" he asked, his tone carrying an edge that hadn't been present when he'd addressed the previous defendants. Time that could be spent on more serious matters. Sarah maintained her composure, though she noticed how different his tone was from just 15 minutes ago, when he patiently listened to a young white businessman explain his parking situation for nearly 10 minutes. "Your Honor, I understand the court's time is valuable. I have documentation showing that the meter in question was malfunctioning that day." Judge Harrison sighed heavily, making a show of checking his watch. "Miss Bennett, did you put money in the meter?" "Yes, Your Honor. I inserted 2 hours' worth of coins, but the meter." "And did you return to find a ticket on your vehicle?" "Yes, if you'll allow me to explain." "It's a simple yes or no question, Ms. Bennett." Judge Harrison interrupted again, his voice carrying a hint of irritation that made several heads turn in the courtroom. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably at his post. Sarah took a deep breath, remembering all the times she'd faced similar treatment in business meetings before people realized she was the owner of Bennett Judicial Designs. She learned to keep her voice steady, her demeanor professional, even when others didn't extend her the same courtesy. "Your Honor," she began again, "I have photos showing the meter's malfunction and statements from 2 other business owners on that street who experienced the same issue that day. I also have the maintenance record for that meter, which I obtained through a public records request, showing it was repaired the following day for the exact issue I experienced." Judge Harrison's face tightened. The more articulate and prepared Sarah appeared, the more his demeanor seemed to sour. He picked up her file, making a show of flipping through it with obvious disinterest. From the gallery, Sarah could hear whispers. A few regular courthouse staff members had paused their work to watch the interaction. The young clerk who'd helped her earlier with the filing process stood near the bench, her expression showing confusion at the judge's unusual hostility. "Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying a finality that suggested he'd made his decision before even reviewing her evidence, "this court sees dozens of parking violations every week. Everyone has an excuse. Everyone has a story. The sign clearly states, 'Park at your own risk.' Mechanical failures do not void citations." Sarah's hand tightened slightly on her portfolio. Inside were not just the photos and documentation about the meter, but also design sketches for the very robe Judge Harrison wore. Sketches she labored over to ensure every judge who wore her creations would project the dignity and fairness the law demanded. "Your Honor, I understand, but—" "That will be enough, Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison declared, adding his signature to a form with a flourish. "The court finds no compelling reason to dismiss this citation. Furthermore, given the time wasted here today, I'm adding a court fee. The original fine of $50 is now $150, due within 30 days. The gallery fell silent. Several observers exchanged glances, having witnessed far lesser fines for similar violations throughout the morning. Sarah stood perfectly still, her expression composed despite the obvious unfairness of the situation. What happened next would change not just Sarah's day, but the entire atmosphere of courtroom 204. Sarah Bennett stood before Judge Harrison's bench, the unfair fines still ringing in her ears. The courtroom had grown unusually quiet, as if everyone present sensed the weight of injustice in the air. At her sides, Sarah's fingers pressed against her portfolio, feeling the smooth leather that contained not just evidence of the broken meter, but 2 decades of her life's work. "Your Honor," Sarah spoke again, her voice steady despite the frustration building inside her, "I would like to present my evidence before you make your final judgment." She began to open her portfolio, but Judge Harrison's sharp voice cut through the air like a knife. "Miss Bennett, "I've made my ruling," he said, his tone dripping with impatience. "Unless you'd like me to increase the fine further for contempt of court, I suggest you accept the judgment and move on with your day." The robe he wore, her creation, shifted as he leaned forward, its perfectly tailored shoulders casting a shadow across his desk. From the gallery, the young woman Sarah had comforted earlier watched with wide eyes. Several court regulars had stopped their usual activities, sensing something unusual in the judge's harsh tone. Even the bailiff, who had seen thousands of cases, shifted uncomfortably at his post. "For the record," Sarah continued, maintaining her professional demeanor, "I would like it noted that I was not allowed to present evidence that would prove the meter's malfunction." She pulled out a photograph, holding it up. "This image clearly shows the error message on the meter's display." Judge Harrison's face darkened. "Miss Bennett, are you questioning this court's authority?" "No, Your Honor," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm merely exercising my right to create a complete record." 20 years of dealing with difficult clients and prejudiced business partners had taught her how to stand her ground without losing her composure. The judge shuffled papers on his desk, deliberately ignoring the photograph. "Let me be very clear, Ms. Bennett. Your fine now stands at $200, and I'm adding a warning for disruptive behavior." He paused, looking at her directly for the first time. "Would you like to continue this discussion and make it $250? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The clerk who had been recording the proceedings stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. Everyone present knew this was beyond unusual. Parking tickets rarely exceeded $50, even with added fees. Sarah took a deep breath, thinking of her father's words again. "Sometimes, baby girl, silence speaks louder than words." She carefully returned the photograph to her portfolio, closing it with a quiet but deliberate click. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying just enough weight to make several heads turn. "I don't need to continue. Everything that needs to be said has been captured by the court reporter." She gestured slightly toward the young woman who had been typing frantically, trying to keep up with the exchange. Judge Harrison's jaw tightened. Something about Sarah's composed demeanor seemed to irritate him even more. "Then we're done here. Next case," he announced, already reaching for the next file. But Sarah didn't move immediately. Instead, she stood perfectly still for a moment, her eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The judge's dismissive posture, the uncomfortable shifts of the courthouse staff, the way his robe, her robe, though he didn't know it, draped across his shoulders. As she turned to leave, a senior clerk hurried into the courtroom through the side door, a piece of paper clutched in her hand. The clerk's eyes darted between Sarah and the judge, a look of recognition and alarm spreading across her face. "Your Honor," the clerk whispered urgently, approaching the bench. "There's something you need to know about Ms. Bennett." Judge Harrison waved her away impatiently. "The case is closed, Mrs. Thompson. We're moving on." But the clerk persisted, her voice dropping even lower as she leaned closer to the judge. "Sir, Ms. Bennett, she's the designer. The one who made your robe." The words hung in the air for a moment, barely audible but carrying the weight of a thunderclap. Sarah, who had reached the courtroom doors, paused with her hand on the handle. She didn't turn around, but she could feel the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. Behind her, Judge Harrison's sharp intake of breath cut through the silence like a knife. "Miss Bennett, please wait." Judge Harrison's voice had lost its sharp edge, replaced by something that sounded almost like concern. Sarah's hand remained on the courtroom door handle, her back still turned to the bench. The portfolio in her other hand felt heavier now, weighted with 2 decades of proving herself in rooms just like this one. Mrs. Thompson, the senior clerk, stood beside the judge's bench, still holding the paper that had caused this sudden change. She cleared her throat and spoke clearly into the quiet courtroom. "Your Honor, Ms. Bennett is the owner and lead designer of Bennett Judicial Designs. Her company has been making the official robes for our state's judiciary for the past 15 years. A wave of whispers swept through the courtroom. The same court staff who had ignored Sarah earlier now stared at her with new interest. The young clerk who had been recording the proceedings stopped typing, her mouth slightly open in surprise. Sarah turned slowly, her movements deliberate and dignified. She faced the bench, where Judge Harrison sat perfectly still, looking down at his own robe, her creation, with an expression of dawning recognition. "The robe you're wearing, Your Honor, Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, was personally designed by Ms. Bennett. It's from her signature collection, released last spring, the one with the modified collar and reinforced shoulders that you specifically requested. Judge Harrison's face had lost some of its color. He ran a finger along the collar of his robe, feeling the subtle improvements Sarah had incorporated into the design. The same features he had praised during his fitting session 6 months ago. Ms. Bennett, he said, his voice noticeably softer now, I had no idea. Why didn't you mention this? Sarah walked back toward the bench, her heels clicking steadily on the polished floor. When she spoke, her voice was clear and controlled. Your Honor, I was here today as a citizen seeking justice, not as your robe designer. My profession shouldn't determine how I'm treated in a court of law. The young woman Sarah had helped earlier let out a small "oh" of recognition. You're that Sarah Bennett. My sister works at the courthouse in Madison. She says your robes are the best they've ever had. More whispers filled the courtroom. A judge from another courtroom, who had stepped in to deliver a message, now stood frozen by the door, wearing one of Sarah's designs as well. He glanced down at his own robe, then back at Sarah, recognition dawning on his face. Judge Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The robe that had seemed so comfortable moments ago now felt heavy on his shoulders. He looked at the fine for $200 he had just written, then at the evidence folder Sarah had tried to show him, the one he had dismissed without even opening. Perhaps, he said, clearing his throat, we should review your evidence, Ms. Bennett. But Sarah remained standing tall, her portfolio still closed. With all due respect, Your Honor, would you be offering to review the evidence because I design your robes, or because it's the right thing to do for any citizen who comes before this court? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Several people in the gallery nodded slightly, and Mrs. Thompson, the senior clerk, gave Sarah a look of quiet approval. Judge Harrison's face flushed. He looked around his courtroom, seeing it perhaps for the first time through new eyes. The robe he wore, Sarah's creation, had been designed to represent justice, dignity, and fairness. Yet in the past few minutes, he had demonstrated none of these qualities. Miss Bennett, he began again, his voice heavy with realization, I believe I owe you an apology. Your Honor, Sarah replied, her voice firm but not unkind. You owe an apology not just to me, but to every person who has stood where I'm standing, seeking nothing more than a fair hearing. She finally opened her portfolio, revealing not just the evidence about the parking meter, but also a stack of design sketches, including one for the very robe Judge Harrison wore. The courtroom fell silent again, waiting to see what would happen next. In that moment, the power dynamic had shifted, not through force or anger, but through the quiet dignity of a woman who had faced such moments all her life and learned to turn them into opportunities for change. Judge Harrison stared at the design sketch in Sarah's portfolio, his fingers tracing the detailed notes she had written in the margins. Each annotation showed thoughtful consideration. Extended collar for better draping during long sessions. Reinforced shoulders to maintain authority without discomfort. Hidden panels for movement during heated testimonies. The courtroom remained silent as Sarah stepped closer to the bench, turning to a new page in her portfolio. This is the original design draft from 6 months ago, Your Honor. You mentioned during your fitting that you wanted something that would command respect while remaining comfortable during long trials. Mrs. Thompson, the senior clerk, moved slightly closer, her eyes wide as she recognized more designs in the portfolio. Miss Bennett, these are remarkable. I had no idea so much thought went into each robe. Judge Harrison's face showed a mix of emotions, embarrassment, respect, and growing understanding. He looked at his reflection in the polished surface of his desk, seeing himself wearing Sarah's creation in a new light. The same robe he had worn proudly during his daughter's law school graduation ceremony last month. You designed this specifically to help judges maintain their composure, he said quietly, more to himself than to the room. The irony of how he had just lost his own composure hit him hard. Sarah nodded, her voice professional but warm. Every robe I design carries the weight of justice in its threads, Your Honor. When I create these garments, I think about the decisions that will be made while wearing them, the lives that will be affected, the importance of remaining dignified and fair. From the gallery, Other courthouse staff had begun to gather. A prosecutor wearing one of Sarah's designs stood in the doorway, recognition dawning on his face. Two more judges had appeared, drawn by the whispers spreading through the building. Each wore Sarah's creations, each now looking at their robes with new understanding. "Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison spoke again, his voice heavy with realization. "You've spent years making sure we look and feel our best while delivering justice. And today, wearing your work, I failed to deliver that same justice to you." Sarah closed her portfolio carefully. "Your Honor, this moment isn't just about me. While designing these robes, I've visited every major courthouse in the state. I've seen countless citizens stand where I stood today, hoping for nothing more than a fair hearing." The young woman Sarah had helped earlier raised her hand slightly. "She's right, Your Honor. Miss Bennett was so kind to me when I was nervous, but she received much harsher treatment for the same kind of violation." Judge Harrison's ears reddened as he remembered his different tones with different defendants throughout the morning. The evidence was clear, not just in Sarah's parking ticket case, but in his own behavior. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward again, her voice gentle but firm. "Your Honor, perhaps this is an opportunity. Miss Bennett's designs have always represented the best of our justice system. Maybe today can remind us to live up to what these robes represent." The judge looked down at his bench, at the harsh fine he had written, at the evidence he had refused to review. His robe, Sarah's creation, suddenly felt heavier on his shoulders, weighted with responsibility and renewed purpose. "Miss Bennett," he said, straightening in his chair, "would you be willing to present your evidence now? Not because of who you are or what you do, but because every citizen deserves that right." Sarah opened her portfolio again, this time to the photographs of the malfunctioning meter. But before she could speak, Judge Harrison raised his hand. "And after we review your case properly," he continued, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "I wonder if you might be willing to share your perspective on how we can better serve all citizens who enter this courthouse." The gallery stirred with interest. Several heads nodded in agreement. Sarah stood tall, her portfolio open, ready not just to present her evidence, but to help transform a moment of bias into an opportunity for change. The robe that had started this revelation was about to serve an even greater purpose, becoming a symbol not just of authority, but of growth, understanding, and true justice. News travels fast in a courthouse, and within 30 minutes of Sarah Bennett's revelation, the hallways buzzed with activity. Judges, lawyers, and court staff gathered in small groups, their whispered conversations echoing off the marble walls. Many of them unconsciously touched their robes or straightened their collars, suddenly aware of whose handiwork they wore. In courtroom 204, Judge Harrison had called for a 15-minute recess. He sat in his chambers, the weight of the morning's events heavy on his shoulders. Through his open door, you could see other judges walking past, each wearing a Bennett design, their faces showing a mix of surprise and embarrassment as they discussed what had happened. "Richard," called Judge Mary Peterson, stopping at his door. She was wearing one of Sarah's newer designs, a robe specifically crafted for female judges. "Is it true? Did you really find Sarah Bennett without reviewing her evidence?" Judge Harrison nodded slowly, running his hands over his face. "I did worse than that, Mary. I treated her differently from the start. The same woman who spent hours making sure our robes would help us serve justice better." Down in the courthouse lobby, Sarah found herself surrounded by courthouse staff and legal professionals. The young clerk who had barely noticed her that morning now stood nearby, clutching a coffee cup and looking ashamed. "Miss Bennett," the clerk said softly, "I'm so sorry about this morning. I didn't." Sarah turned to her with a kind smile. "You don't need to apologize. Maybe we can all learn something from today." More people gathered around, including the young woman Sarah had comforted earlier. She had stayed to watch the events unfold, and now she stepped forward. "Everyone should know how kind Ms. Bennett was to me when I was scared. She helped me even though she was facing the same situation." Mrs. Thompson, the senior clerk who had revealed Sarah's identity, appeared with a stack of files. "Miss Bennett, I pulled the records of similar parking violations from the past month. The differences in how cases were handled are, well, they're quite telling." The courthouse security guard, who had watched Sarah go through the metal detector that morning without a word, now stood straighter as she passed. He touched the sleeve of his uniform, clearing his throat. "Ma'am, my brother's studying fashion design. He always talks about your work. I wish I'd known. That's exactly the point, Sarah said, her voice carrying through the lobby. We shouldn't need to know someone's achievements to treat them with respect. Back in courtroom 204, Judge Harrison emerged from his chambers. The robe seemed to weigh differently on him now as he walked to the bench. The bailiff called the court back to order, and Sarah returned to her place before the judge. The gallery had filled up again, this time with courthouse staff and legal professionals who wanted to witness what would happen next. Among them sat 3 other judges, each wearing Sarah's designs, each watching intently. Miss Bennett, Judge Harrison began, his voice notably different from earlier. Before we review your evidence, I believe the court owes you more than just an apology. We owe you a debt of gratitude, not just for your craftsmanship, but for showing us how far we still have to go. Sarah stood quietly, her portfolio open on the podium before her. The photographs of the malfunctioning meter were visible, but somehow they seemed less important now than the larger issues at hand. From the back of the courtroom, more people continued to arrive. A local attorney who had argued hundreds of cases wearing a suit altered by Sarah's shop years ago. A court reporter who had watched countless defendants stand where Sarah stood. A new judge who had just received her first Bennett robe last week. The atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed. What had started as a simple parking ticket hearing had become something much more significant, a moment of recognition, of reflection, and perhaps of change. Judge Harrison looked out at his courtroom, at the faces watching expectantly, at the robes that now seemed to carry an even greater responsibility. Then he looked back at Sarah Bennett, the woman who had crafted these symbols of justice, only to face injustice herself. The next words he would speak would set the tone not just for this case, but for many cases to come. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the now packed courtroom. Miss Bennett, I'm prepared to dismiss your ticket and the associated fines immediately. He paused, adjusting the robe she had designed. However, I suspect that's not what this is about anymore. Sarah stood at the podium, her evidence still untouched before her. The photographs of the malfunctioning meter seemed almost trivial now compared to the larger issues at hand. She looked around the courtroom, at all the faces watching, waiting. Your Honor, Sarah began, her voice clear and steady. I appreciate the offer to dismiss the ticket, but you're right. This has become about something much more important. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward from her clerk's station, holding a document. Your Honor, if I may, I compiled the statistics you requested during the recess. Over the past 6 months, parking ticket fines have averaged $45 for white defendants and $85 for defendants of color. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Harrison's face reddened, but he nodded for Mrs. Thompson to continue. Furthermore, the clerk added, the rate of dismissed tickets shows a similar pattern. Sarah opened her portfolio, but instead of pulling out the parking meter evidence, she retrieved a different set of papers. Your Honor, while waiting for my case to be called this morning, I observed 17 other cases. I took notes on how each defendant was addressed, how long they were allowed to speak, and the outcomes of their cases. The young woman Sarah had helped earlier raised her hand from the gallery. It's true. I watched too. Miss Bennett was treated completely differently from how you treated me, Your Honor. She wasn't even allowed to finish her sentences. Judge Harrison removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with realization. Miss Bennett, I've spent 20 years on this bench, believing I was delivering equal justice to all. Today, wearing the robe you created to represent justice, I failed to deliver that very thing. Your Honor, Sarah responded, her tone professional but kind. Recognition is the first step toward change. These robes, she gestured to his attire, were designed to remind everyone in the courtroom of the dignity and fairness our justice system promises. But a robe is just fabric without the actions to back it up. From the gallery, another judge spoke up. Ms. Bennett has designed robes for every judge in this building. Perhaps we should all be examining our own records and behaviors. Sarah turned to address the entire courtroom. When I design these robes, I include features meant to help judges maintain their composure during long, difficult days. The reinforced shoulders aren't just for appearance. They're to help you carry the weight of your responsibilities. The comfortable collar isn't just for comfort. It's to help you keep a level head during heated moments. Judge Harrison stood up, a move that surprised everyone in the courtroom. "Miss Bennett, I'd like to propose something. Would you be willing to work with our courthouse to develop a training program? Not about robes, but about the unconscious biases we clearly need to address." Sarah's expression remained thoughtful. "Your Honor, I appreciate the offer. But this isn't about one training session or one morning's revelation. This is about systematic changes that need to happen every day, in every case." The courtroom fell silent, absorbing her words. Even the usual shuffle of papers had stopped. "You're absolutely right," Judge Harrison agreed. "And that's exactly why we need your help. Not because you design our robes, but because you've shown us today how to handle injustice with dignity and turn it into an opportunity for change." Sarah looked around the courtroom one more time, at all the faces waiting for her response. Some wore her robes, others wore suits she'd altered, and some were ordinary citizens who had come for their own cases but stayed to witness this moment. "Your Honor," she said finally, "I would be willing to help, on one condition." "Name it," Judge Harrison replied. "That we start by reviewing not just my case, but every case from this morning. Every person deserves the fair hearing I was initially denied." The gallery erupted in whispers. Judge Harrison looked at his docket, then at the robe he wore, and finally at Sarah Bennett, the woman who had taught him more about justice in one morning than he'd learned in 20 years on the bench. His next words would determine whether this moment would become a real turning point or just another empty promise. 6 months after the parking ticket incident, courtroom 204 looked different. Physical changes were subtle, new signs in multiple languages, a more accessible witness stand, and a modified layout that made the space feel less intimidating. But the real changes went much deeper. Sarah Bennett stood at the back of the courtroom, watching Judge Harrison handle his morning docket. She smiled slightly as she observed his interactions with each defendant, noting how he gave everyone the same respectful attention she had once been denied. "Miss Bennett," whispered Mrs. Thompson, who had joined her in observation, "the statistics from the past 6 months show remarkable improvements. The disparity in fines has dropped by 70%, and hearing times are now consistent across all demographics." Sarah nodded, making notes in her familiar portfolio. These days, it contained more than just robe designs. It held training materials, courthouse feedback forms, and progress reports from every judge who had committed to change. "Your next appointment is here," Mrs. Thompson added. 3 new judges being sworn in today. They've all requested your special orientation session before their first day on the bench." This was new, Sarah's contribution to judicial training. Before any judge could wear one of her robes now, they had to spend a day experiencing court from the other side. They sat in the gallery, went through security, and waited for hours with regular citizens. Some even received mock citations to understand how it felt to stand before the bench. Judge Harrison called a brief recess and approached Sarah. His robe, a newer design she created, included a small golden thread in the collar, a reminder of that day 6 months ago. "The young woman you helped that morning," he said, smiling, "she's starting law school next month. Says you inspired her to become a public defender." Sarah remembered her well, the nervous defendant she'd comforted before her own case. That morning had sparked many such transformations. The courthouse had changed too. Weekly review sessions examined random cases for signs of bias. A new citizen feedback system allowed people to share their courthouse experiences. Even the security guards had received training on respectful interaction. Chief Justice Williams called again. Judge Harrison continued. 3 more courthouses want to implement your program. They're calling it the Bennett Standard now." Sarah looked around the courtroom, remembering that tense morning 6 months ago. The same benches where worried defendants had sat alone now held volunteer court advocates ready to help. The intimidating walk to the podium now included clear markers and supportive signage. A group of law students entered the courtroom, carrying copies of a new textbook. Sarah caught a glimpse of the chapter title, "The Bennett Case: Transforming Judicial Bias into Systematic Change." Her story had become required reading in ethics classes. "Your next design meeting is at 2, Mrs. Thompson reminded her, checking her calendar. The Judges Association wants to discuss incorporating bias reminder elements into all judicial robes statewide. Sarah's business had evolved too. Bennett Judicial Designs now included a consulting division, helping courthouses across the state examine and improve their practices. Her waiting list for robe fittings had grown longer, but now these sessions included discussions about justice and equality along with measurements and fabric choices. Judge Harrison adjusted his robe, a gesture Sarah had seen hundreds of times, but now carried new meaning. You know, Ms. Bennett, when you first stood in this courtroom, I thought I was the one with the power. I never imagined a parking ticket would lead to all this. Sarah watched as people filed back into the courtroom, lawyers, defendants, families, all moving through a space that felt more welcoming than before. Real change, she said quietly, often comes from unexpected moments, Your Honor. We just have to be brave enough to seize them. A new defendant approached the bench, looking nervous. But unlike that morning 6 months ago, she was greeted with a smile and a clear explanation of her rights. Judge Harrison's robe moved with him as he leaned forward, listening attentively to her story. Sarah opened her portfolio, beginning a sketch for her newest robe design. In the margins, she wrote a note. Remember the power of small moments to create big changes. The golden thread in Judge Harrison's collar caught the morning light, a tiny but constant reminder that justice, like fabric, becomes stronger when you acknowledge and repair its weak spots. And in courthouses across the state, more golden threads were being added, one robe at a time.